You're tuned to the Witching Hours on CKCU 93.1 FM in Ottawa. It is me, your host, Kanaska Carter, and I'm here speaking with Ford Fischer, a media producer, journalist, and editor-in-chief at News to Share. How are you doing over there?
Doing great. It's 8 a.m. here in Paris. I've been here for a couple of weeks covering the Yellow Vest protests, and I've got a week to go. So it'll be nice to give your audience a little update on basically what's going on here in France.
So you're currently out in France right now as part of the Yellow Vest movement. Unemployment in France is at 9%, which is considered to be very high. And it seems like the French economy minister, he said that a large percent of population feel left out or behind. What do you think about this statement? Is it true?
Yeah, so basically this is sort of a working class protest that in the American sense, it kind of subverts the kind of left-right spectrum. It's kind of an expression of workers' sort of distaste with government policies that, again, kind of separates from that spectrum. So it started 13 weeks ago over the fact that there was going to be a tax on fuel that would have been seen as a regressive tax. It would have been seen as taking a bigger chunk out of poor people than it does out of rich people, right? Poor people are spending a greater fraction of their income on gas in their car or heating their house or whatever. Mm-hmm. So it started as a protest specifically about that, a tax that was going to affect working class people, but it's kind of broadened into a larger sort of program of issues that they're dealing with. They want higher wages. They want a more progressive tax scheme generally, meaning that they want lower taxes on poorer people and higher taxes on rich people. A lot of it is a resentment about large corporations, particularly international ones. So Amazon is a major employer here, and many of them feel frustrated that they feel like they're paying taxes that the corporations are getting away with not paying.
So why are people in France being forced to pay double the gas prices of people in the U.S.?
I think that it's partially kind of the, I guess, the European culture. There's also an association that some of the Yellow Vests have between those sorts of issues and the EU. So there's kind of a split view on this. It's not, because the Yellow Vests are such a wide coalition, it's not entirely like everybody has exactly the same position, but many of them want to exit the EU on the basis of some things like that. So the idea of a Frexit is on the table for some of them.
Okay, so protesters are arguing that the wealthiest 1% are gaining in tax breaks and the bottom fifth of households are worse off. Has there been any steps to change this, or do you think it will remain the same?
So far, kind of the tangible thing that they've gotten out of doing all of this is that they've gotten Macron's approval ratings to go way down, which kind of forces some level of action. So far, that action hasn't really turned into policy. What it's been is that Macron has kind of joined this program called The Great Debate, where Macron is spending sort of hours per day on certain days doing this television programming where he basically debates with people and has conversations, on television. So I think that the way that this tangibly could turn into change, there are a couple of ways. One is that it could force Macron and the parliament to make changes on the basis that they could get unelected. The other one is that the Yellow Vests actually are demanding the idea of referendums. A lot of it is about the fact that they feel like the politicians aren't actually representing popular interests. So Macron is not popular. The Yellow Vests are quite popular, but Macron's the president and the Yellow Vests don't have a president kind of in power that represents them. So there's this kind of concept of referendum, which is the idea that they could force the government to be to put actual policy proposals to a popular vote, and that would be a substantial chance for them to actually change policy. So far, it hasn't happened, and it's not clear if it will.
Okay, so he seems to be more so representing the wealthy as opposed to anybody below that bracket.
In the opinion of the Yellow Vests, that's true. In the American sense, Macron is probably a little bit comparable to like Hillary Clinton. The criticism is that he's a neoliberal, that he's center left, that he basically represents neoliberal center left capitalism. So he's not he's certainly not on the right, but he's also not a leftist, as you might put in quotes, right? And so this is kind of the left and the right joining together against him on the basis that they think sort of neoliberal capitalism favors the elites. And I've seen a lot of signs that say things to the effect of neoliberalism equals fascism, right? These pictures that are basically Macron's face plastered onto an image of Pinochet or an image of Hitler or something like that. That they basically think that that neoliberalism favors those with lots of financial wealth.
Okay. So could you explain to our listeners about your experiences so far taking part in the Yellow Vest protests?
To be clear, taking part, I'm filming. I'm not participating in them.
Or
I'm
just
not
being
protesting.
there.
Yeah, but being there. So yeah, basically this has been going on for 14 weeks, and each week they call an act, right? So the first week was Act 1, and then Act 2, and so on. So I've been here for 2 weekends that are referred to as acts, and those were Acts 13, and then on Saturday was 14. Basically what they come down to is that you have tens of thousands of people marching, most of them wearing the yellow vest. And the yellow vest, by the way, it's sort of like you might think of the symbol of like a construction worker's cap in the U.S. It's kind of a working class symbol because so many people have jobs that are physical manual labor, and they have to wear reflective yellow vests to do those jobs in construction or what have you. So it's a symbol of working class. Tens of thousands of people march, about 50,000 each weekend recently, and they basically have had entire day-long face-offs with the police, right? So unlike kind of American protests where the police kind of have two objectives, which are to protect the free speech of the people and then protect the public safety, here there is sort of an idea of free speech, but at the same time, the police are very willing to basically hurt or push back on the protesters for the sake of regaining territory or basically just laying the damage down on them. And they don't really protect property so much because the protesters in some cases destroy ATMs, they smash bank windows, that kind of thing. And the police don't really get in the way of the property destruction. It kind of is just a roving brawl that takes all day. So I looked at my health app at the end of each time. I walked 10 miles last Saturday and 12 miles this Saturday.
Nice.
And I basically did the same march route as kind of an average yellow vest person, I guess, starting from the morning. And so it's a long route throughout the city, and it's kind of just combat with the police the whole way.
Oh my
the
God.
Other thing that's rather different than American protests is that the police don't seem to consider making arrests to be an imperative. It's really about hurting the people back, but in many cases people will get pretty severely injured, but the police won't put an enormous amount of effort into making arrests. So it's really to some extent, it's about the fight. The one other thing that I'll add to that is that in the eyes of a working class uprising with sort of socialist elements and things like that, because police are considered to be working class people themselves, they're branded often as kind of pawns of the elite, or in socialist terms, they are considered to be class traitors, according to the LFS. So a very, very common phrase, right, that the protesters will use is like, you're on the wrong side. The police should be on our side because they're also poor. They're tools for the elite, and they're letting the elite use them that way.
Okay. So red scarves are defending democracy and demand an end to the violence. What type of violence have you seen or heard so far other than, I believe, someone lost 4 fingers? Can you confirm if that is true?
Yeah. Okay, so... Right. So that was a pretty loaded statement. So let me, I'll break it up into a few things. I'll answer the last thing first. The Reds, so yes, one person did lose basically the entire, all but their thumb, right? A gigantic chunk of their hand. I was about 100 feet away when that happened, and I had to, but I didn't, I actually didn't know that someone lost their hand until seeing video later. And I was able to figure out where I was by synchronizing my video to the video of that wound. So I had filmed that skirmish, but I wasn't immediately right next to it when the hand was blown off. So to explain basically how that happened, the police use tear gas, as most people in America probably have an idea of how tear gas works or what that looks like. But the thing that France has that is actually banned everywhere in Europe except for France is what's called a GLI F4 grenade. And the GLI F4 grenade is a tear gas grenade. It contains tear gas, but it has 25 grams of TNT in it. So the original detonator before the tear gas deployment basically is a tiny bomb, right? So these have been thrown past me. I've seen them explode within meters of me. They're extremely loud and they have a large flash. And then basically once they've exploded, you're going to end up with tear gas in your area. And so you really have to run. The problem is, yeah, if it physically is touching somebody or is right next to somebody at the moment of explosion, 25 grams of TNT is not a lot. Again, that's one, I guess, 80th of a kilogram. If you think about, like, in a movie, someone says, like, we've got, 50 kilograms of TNT, right? This is an 80th of 1 kilogram. It's not a huge amount. But in this particular case, there's mixed reporting as to whether he picked it up to throw it back, whether it was fired and just happened to hit his hand at the moment of explosion, whether he caught it. But one way or another, this thing exploded, touching his hand, and yeah, he lost his hand.
It's crazy.
As to the Red Scarves, so I haven't personally attended a Red Scarf event yet because there hasn't been one since I've been here. The Red Scarves are basically a counter-protest movement that claims to be against the violence of the Yellow Vests.
Okay.
The thing about that is that when I've spoken to Yellow Vests, many of them see them as sort of controlled opposition. That it's really that there are lots of criticisms that the Macron government is using of the Yellow Vests to try to delegitimize their issues, because the Yellow Vests' issues are actually very popular. The Yellow Vests have a high approval rating, above 50%. Macron's approval rating is fairly low. So the Red Scarves, by counter-protesting, are basically suggesting that the Yellow Vests are violent, and on their face the Yellow Vests are saying, we're protesting against the idea of using violence in politics. The both sides would say that they're pro-democracy, right? The Red Scarves would say we're coming out here and protesting against the idea of violence in politics, ergo we are the true Democrats. We're the true people who are in, I don't mean that in terms of party Democrats, those who are in favor of democracy. The Yellow Vests are saying, well, we're the ones in favor of democracy because we are demonstrating that the government is not actually representing what the people want, and so we are an expression of the frustration that we have on this. So if we use violence until we get a referendum that puts the issues that the people care about to a vote, then it's in fact us who are in favor of democracy. And so you kind of have strife in that sense because both sides would say that.
So it's like they're not really being heard, so they're trying to make a point by using violence, I guess.
Right. And because it's a wide coalition, it's not like all of them are using violence. When you have 50,000 people on the street, it's not like all 50,000 are doing violence. It's kind of the front lines. It's the people who face off with the police. To some extent, it's the anti-fascist bloc. So people should remember that Antifa, as we've kind of conceived it in America, really started in Europe, right? It's actually a European phenomenon originally. And so there are anti-fascist blocs at the Yellow Vest protests, and they tend to be more likely to engage in kind of the property destruction and the actual setting things on fire and breaking the banks and things like that. And I've spoken to Yellow Vests as well while walking around, who have told me that their opinion is that the Antifa are delegitimizing them, are making them seem violent, which is hurting their messaging, things like that. So some of them have mixed opinions on whether or not violence is kind of the answer, or if so, what kind of violence. They seem to more coherently be in favor of fighting the police because the police are directly sort of against them. But the idea of smashing an ATM or a bus stop, is that getting back at society, or is that just hurting, whoever has to sit at the bus stop on their way to work tomorrow?
Right. So what made you decide to head out to France in the first place? Was it you just heard about this and you needed to go and report on it, or?
Yeah, well, so this had been going on for weeks, of course, right? So this will probably go on for some long amount of time. I've seen plans as far out as Act 20, right? So 20 weeks in. I will have only been here for Acts 13, 14, and 15. So I missed the first 13 weeks of it. I'm going to miss 5 more weeks of it, assuming that I don't make it back to Paris on time for more of it. I guess the thing that I saw is that the American mainstream media covered it a little bit in the very beginning, and then they just stopped, as if the LFS protests had stopped, and they hadn't. This is a movement in a Western country that has pretty close relations with the U.S. That is talking about many of the issues that I think are to some extent applicable in the U.S. A lot of the same concerns that the Yellow Vests have are applicable in the U.S. And it seems like the mainstream media doesn't want to talk about it, probably because it doesn't fit their narrative of left versus right. Right now, CNN, Fox, all the rest sort of profit and get their ratings from the idea of left versus right political conflict, that you're with Trump or you're against Trump, you're with Republicans or you're with Democrats, whatever. And I think that that's why they've not wanted to report on the Yellow Vests, because this is really left and right rising up together against the state. And I think that that's what the media doesn't really want to show you, and also doesn't profit from showing you. But that doesn't mean that it's not important. So I wanted to be here for at least a portion of it to document and be able to both have that video kind of for the historical record, but also because I wanted to show Americans what's going on right now in France. I think that the fact that the mainstream media isn't talking about it is quite sad, and I also think it's quite deliberate. And so this, in a way, my coverage is an act of protest against the way that the mainstream media fails to cover these stories.
Well, it's good that you're doing that. Somebody's got to do it.
Right.
So do you have any upcoming events or things that you want to cover outside of what's happening in France right now?
Well, so outside of the Yellow Vests, I will say that France has had a lot of offshoot issues and protests that have come out of these things. So one accusation that's been levied against the Yellow Vests is that they're anti-Semitic, which is broadly rejected by them. I've never seen any allusion to anti-Semitism, any slurs, anything like that on the street. I've only ever seen signs condemning anti-Semitism. That being said,
or anti-Israel.
Or anti-Israel, right, which again is sort of applicable in the United States right now. Right. With that in mind, actually today at 7 p.m. in France time, so 1 p.m. U.S. time, there is going to be a anti-Semitism march
awesome.
Here in Paris. And so what'll be interesting about that is that it will probably be predominantly Yellow Vests in attendance, but theoretically it's supposed to have all aspects of civilian life. And there were even rumors about government officials who would be showing up, pro-Macron government officials. So it'll be really interesting to cover that and see whether there ends up being strife among competing types of people who all claim to be anti-Semitic, and so they should all theoretically be standing together on this issue, right? So whether they can unify on that, or whether they'll be fighting because they've, consumed the same physical space. It would be a rather provocative event if an event against anti-Semitism ended up having problems like that.
I get a feeling that people are confusing Zionism with being an anti-Semite, like people not liking Zionism. You know what I mean? With what's happening with Israel and Palestine.
That's become a rather American situation, and I think it's largely due to the foreign policy connection between the United States and Israel as it relates to foreign and military aid. So that has fostered a host of debate about what exactly is acceptable discourse and what exactly crosses the line, what counts as a slur. And in some cases, it seems that certain Congress people and such say things that they don't intend as slurs, and other people perceive them that way. So that's certainly something that is, again, complicated. In the case of the Yellow Vests, it seems like a few very narrow and specific instances of anti-Semitism have been levied against their entire movement, when it's unclear who exactly perpetrated them, and it's certainly not representative of their of their broader goals, mission, or values.
Okay. Well, as always, you're doing amazing work. I just want to, if you have any social media, Patreon link, or anything you would
Sure.
like listeners to know about.
Yeah, so my outlet is called News to Share. It's news, the number two share, and you can find that on Facebook or Twitter. My name is Ford Fischer, Ford like the car, Fischer, Fischer. And my work is citizen supported, so I'm not funded by the mainstream media, and obviously not the state. So I like to use this website that allows people to subscribe to kind of donate perpetually. It's kind of a perpetual crowdfunding called Patreon. That's patreon.com/ and then my name, Ford, Ford, Fischer, Fischer.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And if you have anything else that you're covering in the future, just let me know. We'll get you back on the show.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Have a great night.
You too.
Thanks. Bye. You're tuned to The Witching Hours on CKCU 93.1 FM in Ottawa. We're just speaking with Ford Fischer, who is the editor-in-chief at News to Share. He is also a media producer and journalist. Don't go anywhere, folks. We've got a great show coming up for you tonight on The Witching Hours. I'm your host, Kanaska Carter.